Hey you, yes you, spoilers for this game you. Go eat yakisoba pan or something, I don't know. Also, all footage from 13 Sentinels was captured on a PS4. Don't come after me, Atlas, please. Welcome back to The Medium is Meaning, the series where I take a look at games and examine how the interactivity they provide can shape the way they tell their stories. And to commemorate the release of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim on Switch, no spoilers, I promise, this time we're going to be looking at one of my favorite forms of storytelling out there, the nonlinear narrative. One of the main attractors of a story told in a non-chronological order is that it keeps the person going through the story constantly engaged. It's not just about seeing the story unfold, but rather it's trying to piece together the actual narrative based on the disjointed way information is presented. With games in particular, there's an aspect their interactivity provides that allows them to excel at telling nonlinear stories, and that's having a branching narrative. Player choice is taken into consideration, and a story can be crafted around that central idea of plot progression. Think of a choose-your-own-adventure book, or one of those YouTube series where the viewer can make choices that affect the plot points and ending they ultimately see. This form of player interaction allows the player to shape the narrative instead of merely going through the story linearly with a set beginning, middle, and end. While many games do provide this form of storytelling to the player, one of the best examples of a series that takes advantage of this is with the Zero Escapes trilogy written by Kotaro Uchikoshi. The series' premise revolves around 9 unwilling participants being kidnapped and trapped in a facility to play what's called a nonary game, with their only means of escape is to go through and solve a myriad of intricate escape rooms to hopefully find a way to escape, with each entry providing a new wrinkle on how this premise is played out. The variations in how each death game is structured provides an interesting way to funnel through each game's branching narrative. Yes, the series does have the player make choices which affect how they proceed through the story, just like other interactive games or media mentioned before. But instead of doing what other stories do, where the different routes serve as alternate events inconsequential to each other, where Zero Escape differs is every single route is required to go through in order to unlock and to make sense of each game's true ending. Normally, this is a risky narrative choice to make. After all, if a plot element that was set up in another timeline never occurred in the one wherein the true ending takes place, how can the ending pay off those events when characters don't even know what happened? It's simple. There will always be someone who is knowledgeable of the events that happen in the other routes, and that's the player going through the story. Zero Escape uses the gameplay of making different decisions to impact how the story unfolds and integrates that gameplay aspect into its overarching narrative. Whether it's information a character hasn't shared with the others, or the story showing an event that hasn't happened yet. Because the player is an observer of the story, they will be knowledgeable about these occurrences, even if they haven't happened or won't happen at all in every timeline. That's just a byproduct of nonlinear stories regardless of medium. The player will always naturally be more aware of information that other characters aren't as the story progresses. This idea is extremely prevalent in Zero Escape, where after the player finishes a route, they'll be conscious of the information in that route and use it to make different decisions when going back in order to go down a different branch of the timeline, seeing an alternate way in how the story plays out. This idea of awareness and using the interactivity of games to alter how events of the story unfolds, all organized by a nifty flowchart, is the foundation of the story each Zero Escape game wants to tell. All this is encompassed in the plot with the morphic genetic field theory. And I apologize to all the physicists out there for this incredibly crude and surface-level explanation, but it goes over how our collective consciousness is all connected through an invisible field to the naked eye, and it allows us to send information through those invisible fields across both space and time.
What was that phenomenon? For two organisms to communicate with one another in the absence of physical contact. The morphogenetic field theory.
This theory also serves as a plot device to have the protagonists of each game aware of the events of another timeline, despite not physically partaking in them. It allows both the player and the protagonist to be on the same page at the same time, grounding the player in the character's shoes without having to retread old ground and repeatedly feed the same information they already saw in another timeline. Still, the writing is smart enough to not have these characters know this theory to keep their reactions fresh when they end up confused over why a situation feels familiar. As a result, This creates a forward momentum of unraveling the plot and the mystery of why these characters are trapped, without sacrificing a lot of the actual mystery behind the nonary game. While the first game of the series, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, and 9 Doors, does heavily deal with this concept, it's the second game, Virtue's Last Reward, that fully goes all out with it, having this element of the plot effectively shown thanks to the interactivity games as a storytelling medium provides. Again, as mentioned before, in a scenario where something has happened in a different timeline, or if a scene plays out with a different outcome, the protagonist of VLR, Sigma, will address the familiarity of the scene, but then puzzle over why he already knew of the outcome despite it being the first time experiencing the situation. Of course, as the player, we know the reason why he's conscious of all these events happening. That's because he gained the information in another branch of the timeline. This heavily ties into the two ways of how progression works through the flowchart. The first being the main way decisions are made in Virtue's Last Reward. One of the major factors that dictates how the player progresses through the game's many branching pathways is with the Ambidex game, or AB game for short. Essentially, teams of either a solo or a pair are grouped with another team in order to solve an escape room to find a key. These keys are used to access elevators called the Ambidex room, where teams that were grouped together either vote ally or betray against each other. Bracelet points, or BP, are then allocated to each team depending on what the voting results were, with the starting value being 3 and fluctuating each round the AB game is played. If both teams vote ally, then they both gain 2 BP. If both teams vote betray, then neither team gains any points. However, in the case where one team votes ally while the other team chooses betray, the team who chooses betray would gain 3 BP, whereas the allying team would lose 2 BP, with the risk of being executed if their BP value reaches 0 or below. This continues until at least one person acquires 9 or more points, allowing them to leave the one and only exit door that can only be opened once. It's basically a variation of the prisoner's dilemma, and serves as a glorified way of deciding whether the player wants to go down one route or another. This creates a tense scenario for the player, as they have to gauge what the opponent might vote for and use that to decide their own vote. Despite this, once a vote is done, the player will have known what the opponent would have voted for in that specific round when going back to pick the other option. This would hypothetically take away the tension of going through that specific round of voting again if the player has already seen the outcome once. However, VLR is fully aware of this, and turns this feeling of security provided by the flowchart mechanic against the player. For example, in the initial vote against Alice, if the player chooses to ally, then the result would show Alice picking betray, where she would proceed to mock Sigma for selecting that option.
The best way to minimize risk and maximize reward in this situation is to choose betray. Anyone who thinks otherwise is, well, an idiot.
So naturally, when going back to redo that choice, with this knowledge in mind, choosing betray is a better option, so neither team would gain or lose points.
What? Wait a minute. Last time? What on earth are you talking about?
When playing through VLR for the first time, this caught me completely off guard. It was also revealed that Alice voted minutes before Sigma did, so her decision was finalized before the player made the choice. This adds the element of Schrodinger's cat to how the player goes through the game, showing the decision the player makes can not only alter the events that take place in the future, but can also dictate the state of things in the past as well. Another example happens soon after, where depending on who Sigma's first opponent was during the first round of voting, the corpse of an old woman will appear in one of the voting rooms, while in one other branch, there's not a corpse to be seen. Despite these instances only happening a few times, these are powerful moments in setting an air of unpredictability redoing each vote. Even though more times than not, the outcome will always still be the same, the anticipation for there potentially being a change takes the reassurance of having prior knowledge away from the player and weaponizes it against them, which overall adds to the distrusting and claustrophobic atmosphere the game already excels at, and also allows the mysteries of the death game to still be prevalent even as the player slowly gains more information on the events that are happening. The other way VLR uses players' awareness of different timelines is with how it gates progression. There will be many scenarios that will arise that prevents players from progressing through a route if they don't have enough information to proceed. Examples being finding a way to get out of a life or death situation, presenting an accusation or a theory, or requiring a password to access something. The player needs to go down the other branches and routes of the flowchart in order to find the answers they need. These can range from finding an item in one of the puzzle rooms the player hasn't explored yet, or being grouped with another team and learning new information when interacting with them. The new info the player and Sigma gain allows them to know the solution to the initial problem that prevented them from progressing, enabling them to continue down that route. The main, and in my opinion, best example of this gameplay mechanic being demonstrated is with the murder of Alice. In almost every single route, save for a few exceptions, Alice will be found dead in one of the crew quarter cabins, with a stab wound in her chest. In one route in particular, progression is locked until evidence is brought up regarding the truth of Alice's death. The solution to this mystery is located in a completely different route in a laboratory. There, a journal is discovered discussing the symptoms of a virus called Radical-6, which the character of Quark was confirmed to be infected with after he collapsed in every single route, giving context to that event as well. The virus slows the speed that the brain can process information by a square root of 6, the normal rate, hence the name Radical-6. This causes the infected to perceive the world around them as sped up, and the inability to process everything at a normal pace overloads the brain, causing infected to have an intense urge to commit suicide. This as a result serves as evidence that a possibility exists that Alice wasn't murdered by anyone else. Despite this being the key piece of information needed to solve the mystery of Alice's death and progress further down that route, Virtue's Last Reward is still excellent at feeding hints about the symptoms of Radical-6 and Alice's suicide even when going down other branches of the flowchart. As mentioned before, Quark in every route passes out and is confirmed to be infected with Radical-6 despite its symptoms being unknown at the time. In some branches, he wakes up shortly after and attempts to stab himself with a scalpel, screaming for death, with Alice also attempting to stab herself shortly after Quark gets knocked out, giving a major hint at the symptoms of Radical-6. The hints in the other branches are a bit more subtle, with one having Sigma experience the world around him speeding up, demonstrating one of the effects of the virus. In one of the more shocking and abrupt endings, characters begin to go missing and some begin to act sluggish. It all culminates to Sigma finding almost everyone's bodies in a bloody heap, with a scalpel laying on the floor, as Sigma uses that bladed weapon to stab himself, which lines up with the way the virus kills its victims. By always providing a mix of minor and major revelations within each branch, the player will always be learning something new they can use as context when going down another pathway of the flowchart, no matter which route they funnel down first. It incorporates the novelty games can provide as a choose-your-own-adventure story, and also uses a flowchart and morphogenetic fields to narratively contextualize that kind of interactivity as a gameplay mechanic to create a compelling and suspenseful story that's engaging to see how everything comes together in the true ending. While I overall think Virtue's Last Reward is my favorite usage of this kind of interactivity, that's not to say other games, including future titles from Uchikoshi, slack in this department either. If anything, the interactive non-linear narrative the first Zeroscape game dabbled in, and subsequently perfected in the second, serves as a basis for other games to expand upon. The third entry in the Zeroscape series, Zero Time Dilemma, and more recently, the game 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, adds a major shakeup to this format that demonstrates an evolution of how games can truly construct a non-linear narrative, but I'll delve into that later. For now, I want to spotlight 2019's The Somnium Files, a game also written by Uchikoshi. As mentioned before, structuring a narrative around an interactive branching flowchart that offers insight in different events is great at establishing not only compelling mysteries, but also compelling ways to solve those mysteries. And what better way to spotlight that structure better than with a murder mystery story? Murder mysteries in general work really well within the medium of video games. In other mediums such as movies or television, the viewer is merely watching the characters on screen solve the murders. While the viewer can try and piece together information in their heads to follow along with the story, it's not necessarily required. By contrast, a game tasks player to solve those mysteries at their own pace through a playable character. Piecing together clues to reach a conclusion isn't an optional thing the player can do when consuming the story, but rather it becomes a necessity in order to progress and to see what the rest of the narrative has to offer. As a result, the active participation between the player and the mystery work together to create a more engaging narrative. So what if we take that aspect in a murder mystery game and combine it with the multiple timelines and flowcharts of the Zero Escape series? Well bam! You have the Somnium Files. While it's not my favorite murder mystery story out there, the honor goes to this game right here, the way takes the structure of multiple timelines definitely makes it one of the most clever and unique ones out there. The usual routine in murder mysteries are still here, investigating crime scenes, talking to witnesses, interrogating suspects, to even a wrinkle in the formula with the game's main gimmick of the Somniums, where the protagonist Date uses his AI eyeball partner Aiba to peer into the minds and dreams of suspects to extrapolate more information that they couldn't have discovered via conventional means. However, it's the flowchart that's been synonymous with Uchikoshi games that elevates a relatively simple mystery to something truly special.
Parallel worlds exist.
As usual, sections of the storyline can branch off and funnel down into a specific route, each having their own specific endings. And occasionally, Date can get glimpses of what happens in another part of the timeline, though that aspect has been toned down considerably this time around. But it's how the game handles the information gained from each route that is the most interesting part. There are still some overlapping clues to be discovered and events that occur in every route, but there will also be some things that happen in one route that blatantly contradicts what happens in another. The strongest example being how the character Sosajima was revealed and proved to be the culprit in one route, only to be found as a victim in another, throwing into question the identity of the true culprit. Or how the internet idol streamer Iris can be cheery and airheaded, having dreams about streaming Minecraft.
I'm gonna be playing Shovel Forge today. Shovel Forge. Shovel Forge?
Shovel Forge.
A sandbox game in which you make and move cubes to create structures on a map.
Shovel Forge.
Shovel Forge. Shovel Forge.
Shovel Forge is a game in which you manipulate cubes on the terrain to build structures.
Shovel Forge. When in a different branch, she's incredibly cold and calculated, with her dreams being... that. Additionally, Iris was one of the main suspects in the gruesome murder of her producer, Renju Okira. But in the routes where she's cheerful, Renju hired a group of masked men to kidnap her, on top of staging a breakout of a convicted criminal related to a previous serial murder case. Essentially, a role reversal with Iris. The game uses its branching narrative to craft an intricate mystery, one that normally takes reliable information in other murder mystery stories and turns it unreliable. After all, how could something be both true yet false at the same time? Who can you really trust when people's actions wildly differ across different timelines? Thus, instead of trying to piece together a mystery that takes place in a singular time frame, the player has to analyze and compare multiple timelines that span across different realities and make sense of all their contradictions in order to reach the singular culprit.
Parallel worlds exist.
And what makes this interactive structure so great for crafting a narrative like this is that the experience of going through the story for each player will be uniquely individual for them. For example, the first ending I got when going down the flowchart was one where almost everyone died. Starting the game off with a bang, making me much more invested with the mystery of just what the hell was going on, as well as the abundance of murders allowing me to narrow down a pool of suspects easier. Whereas another person could have gotten an ending that fleshes out another character, making them care about that character more when going down the subsequent routes. There's no right or wrong way to approach going down the flowchart, and it takes great writing in order to make each path feel relevant with meaningful reveals on top of engaging the player to see what happens next, managing to make each route stand on their own, but also contributing to the overarching narrative, and ultimately, when all the pieces finally get put together in the game's true ending. Now, while the story these games presents are technically non-linear thanks to their branching flowcharts and being able to hop back to any section within said chart, each route primarily has a linear story to follow. The player will always know where in the flowchart they're at in relation to other branches. An easier way to visualize this is with an example in 9 Hours, 9 Persons, and 9 Doors, where a river flowing down a stream splits into two. Let's call these paths A and B. Yes, the player can go back to where the metaphorical river splits and go down the other path, but it still remains that the only direction they can go down is, well, down. If we put that same logic in a narrative perspective, technically a story structured this way is non-linear, with there being multiple paths, but going down pathway A and disregarding path B is still a linear story. Going down pathway B and disregarding path A is still also going to be a linear story. It's basically just a string of linear stories tied together at certain points. Now, what about stories that take the idea of telling a non-linear narrative to the extreme? One where the main appeal is not just viewing a story, but rather piecing one together. This is where the third and final game in the Zeroscape series, Zero Time Dilemma, comes in. While this installment of the Zeroscape franchise suffers from some narrative problems and abysmal presentation,
Oh, yes! Yes! Hell yeah! We're alive! We're actually alive! Yeah!
the way the game presents its narrative to the player is both ambitious and admirable. The flowchart Zeroscape is known for is back and in full swing, but ZDT introduces what's called the fragment system. Essentially, outside the beginning setup and the ending segments of the game, the player is given a choice to play through different story sections called fragments. These fragments are split between the three teams, C Team, Q Team, and D Team, and have to be tackled both out of order and out of context. You could hypothetically play through a segment that takes place near the end of the game, and then hop straight into another that happens near the beginning. This narrative structure is able to demonstrate a range of personalities within a character, depending on the scenario they're in. For example, returning character Akane can act both sympathetic and frail towards others, while in another fragment she could be wielding a goddamn chainsaw trying to murder everyone. This can be a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's cool to see the different ways a character would react in the different situations they are thrusted in. On the other, the quick shift in characterization can be a bit jarring, especially for returning characters. And while it didn't bother me personally, some of the tension could be taken away when witnessing a grisly character death, only to immediately hop to another fragment where everyone is just vibing. But even so, the way each fragment is used to contribute to the overarching narrative is where the most interesting part of ZDT's narrative lies. Because the story is presented completely out of order, mixed in with Zeroscape's signature branching narrative and flowchart, it's up to the player to figure out just what the hell is going on in the story. As mentioned before, when starting each section, the player is dropped into the scenario they selected without knowing any of the prior events leading up to it, which fits in with the characters also not knowing what's going on because they get their memories wiped every 90 minutes, essentially at the end of every fragment. It's up to the player to decipher the events and context clues in order to know where they currently are in the timeline in relation to other fragments of other groups. The main way players do this is to pay attention to the announcer that announces the current victims at the end of every fragment. Sometimes it's blatantly obvious to figure out. An example being during the setup, the teams had to perform a majority vote to choose what other team they would like executed. So when the announcer states that a full team is currently deceased, it's safe to assume that specific section of the story takes place in a timeline where one of the teams were executed. Other times, the process of deciphering which timeline the player is occupying based on the deaths can be a little more involved than figuring out. For example, in the Monty Hall fragment for Team C, the end of the fragment has Junpei and Carlos die, with the announcer also stating that the entirety of Q Team and 5 from D Team have been killed off. Likewise, D Team's transporter fragment starts off with 5 being missing, and is later revealed to share the same list of victims as Monty Hall. thus confirming that these sections take place within the same timeline. The player can also see how Phi died as well in the fire fragment for Team D, giving context to her death and tying all of these fragments together. All of these sections could have been tackled in any order by the player, creating a unique and individual experience depending on how a player chooses to approach it. A player who saw Phi's death first will know what led up to her death when the announcer states her passing in Monty Hall, where by contrast, a player who chose to do Monty Hall first will question how Phi died due to the lack of context, making them curious to find out the truth. On top of all that, this isn't even taking into account the branching narrative aspect Zeroscape offers. At the end of each fragment, the player is put into a life or death choice that decides the fate of the team the player is currently playing as. And this adds another complex layer to the story. Going back to the Phi example in Fire, her death in this segment that springboarded into Team C's Monty Hall fragment is only one of 3 possible outcomes. The outcome the player chooses during the decision portions dictates what fragment happens next chronologically. I already mentioned before that Monty Hall takes place after Phi dies, but if the player has both Sigma and Diana die, then the next fragment Team C participates in would be titled Anthrotic Principle. If the entirety of D Team lives, then C Team would have to tackle the Ampidex story segment. And to once again reiterate, all of these fragments can be played through in any order of each other. Though once again, the game does provide a flowchart to make ciphering through these events easier to follow. This makes experiencing Zero Time Dilemma's story much more involved than previous entries. The interactivity of picking and choosing story segments to play through without any context creates a truly non-linear narrative where part of the fun is piecing together everything that happens. Despite this, there are some caveats to this non-linear narrative structure. Having 3 set teams that never change makes it easier to keep track of the events to prevent the story from becoming an overly convoluted mess. But this results in there being little in the form of interactions between the other teams, excluding a few exceptions. It can feel very limiting, especially after previous entries would constantly group different characters with varying personalities together through the different branches. Still, seeing how everything in the narrative connects together is immensely satisfying, and while the execution can be a bit janky sometimes, I can't help but respect the bold decision to structure the story in both a non-linear and unconventional way. It's something that I haven't really seen attempted again, that is, until 2020. "13 Sentinels Aegis Rim", developed by Vanillaware, is one of the most intricate and well thought out stories I've ever experienced. So much so that I'll try my best to explain why the narrative works so well without delving into any major spoilers. It takes all the gripes I had with Zero Time Dilemma and railguns them out of existence. While it can lean on the predictable side, and I'm personally not too fond of the ending, the way it utilizes the medium of video games to create a completely non-linear narrative elevates an already great story to one that truly stands apart from other games like it. The story is split between 3 different modes that can be accessed from the main menu. Destruction, which takes place at the climax of the story, where mechanical kaiju monsters called daimos have invaded and are destroying Earth, leaving it up to the 13 protagonists to stop them. This is essentially where the game's battles take place. There's Remembrance, which has the player follow the stories of the 13 different protagonists spanning different time periods to see the events leading up to the invasion, with those 13 different storylines all told out of order with one another. Out of all the modes, Remembrance is where the bulk of the story is told. And finally, there's Analysis, which serves as a handy chronological documentation of all the events the player has already gone through, fit with brief summaries players can refer to refresh up on the plot. So to recap, that's 13 different storylines to go through, 14 if you count the battle segments during Destruction mode, all told non-chronologically of each other, spanning decades of in-game story time. That's more than quadruple the amount of perspectives the player has to go through in Zero Time Dilemma. It's something that should not work, and yet through great writing combined with the interactive medium of games, Vanillaware was able to craft a non-linear narrative that even more than the previous games I mentioned, doesn't just demand the player to pay close attention to the story, but to actively engage with it by piecing together the literal story itself. The game also fixes the issue I had in Zero Time Dilemma of the characters not interacting much with each other. You get to see the characters bump into each other frequently, and some of those interactions can be 2 character storylines converging, potentially revealing context to a moment for those who already went through both characters' sections, or an upcoming surprise to those who haven't yet. This all circles back to the idea of how individual progressing through these stories can feel to each player, even more so than other games I discussed before. 13 Sentinels deals with 14 different viewpoints of the story, with the 13 characters each having their own flowcharts to go through as well, on top of this being a story spanning vastly different time spans, which thankfully is all documented in a chronological list based on the events the player has already gone through. And that's why nonlinear narratives work so well within this medium. Because there are so many branching paths to choose from, how one person engages with the story at a given time will be vastly different than another. Stories presented in this fashion allows the player to engage with what they're being presented, to put together what exactly is going on with the story. While other mediums such as movies and TV have done this concept effectively, I think video games and the player interactivity that comes with it elevates this concept. Even within a non-chronological narrative in a film or TV series, the viewer is presented with information to process in a set order the way the writer intended. Everyone going through the story will get the same revelations at the same pace at the same time, whereas games provide opportunities for a player to actively seek and process the pieces of a story in any order they please. So what one person might experience at a given time could be vastly different than another. Perhaps a player stumbled upon a shocking revelation without the context behind it, thus creating a mystery for the player to theorize what that context could be leading up to it. Whereas another player who saw that context beforehand can have that plot point hit harder once they finally reach it. Just like with the games before, it's a daunting task to have so many moving parts to a story and allowing the player to tackle it in whatever order they want, especially in the case of 13 Sentinels, where there are so many different entry points and ways the player can funnel through the narrative, on top of everything being told out of order. It takes incredible balance and planning in how the writing presents its plot points in order to make these various ways of going through the story feel both satisfying and coherent, giving the player the feeling that the way they went through the narrative was how the story was meant to be played out. And yet, somehow the game is able to drip feed enough information in each path to have the player slowly see the bigger picture of the story regardless of how they approach it. But at the same time, not enough information to have the player guess everything the story has to offer, keeping them engaged to continue playing as a result. With so many interweaving storyline, Aegis Rim's narrative straddles the line of being a convoluted mess, and admittedly, with a story of such a grand scope with over a dozen characters, some storylines are much more interesting than others, but even then, they all serve a purpose to build this ambitious world, story, and characters. Ultimately, the non-linearity of this story enhances the narrative being told, making the great moments even more fantastic, and still able to keep the player engaged even during some of the weaker moments of the story. It's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. You absolutely want the final picture to look good, but that's not really the main appeal of it. The fun of a jigsaw puzzle is the act of piecing everything together, going through each piece to see how it fits in relation to others. If you become stuck, you start on another section of the puzzle to get a clearer picture. It may be confusing and a lot to sift through at first, especially with the vast amount of pieces and how any piece can be used as a starting piece. But as more and more of the pieces click, the picture slowly but surely becomes clearer, and the later pieces are easier to figure out where they fit in the grand scheme. So when the final picture is done, it feels satisfying to finally put everything together. That same satisfaction is how I feel about this method of nonlinear storytelling in the first two Zeroscape games, the Somnium Files, and especially Zero Time Dilemma and 13 Sentinels. It takes advantage of the interactive medium games provide to make a branching and nonlinear narrative possible, in addition to entrusting the player with engaging and finding story beats the game presents in order to see how it fits into the overarching narrative. So even in the case when the story isn't all that great, there's still a strong sense of satisfaction of finally seeing the full picture of the narrative. The novelty and the experience of piecing together a story enhances and elevates the enjoyment of the narrative itself, regardless of its quality. Nonlinear stories are very special to me. It aims to be different, unique, and pushes the boundaries of how narratives can be conventionally told. It's thanks to me discovering 999 over a decade ago that I've had such an interest in the unique and captivating ways a writer can tell their stories through the medium of video games. That's a large part of why I wanted to do this series in the first place. And with later works from the series, as well as other games, that adoration for nonlinear narratives has only grown. And that leaves us with today. With the sequel to The Somnium Files coming this June, and the surprise underdog success of 13 Sentinels, which will only grow with the Switch port releasing in a few days, at least at the time this video is being put out, it's safe to say we're in the timeline where these special types of stories are here to stay.
Parallel worlds exist,